F1's defending champion McLaren showed us how advanced its new 2026 car really is when it finally joined pre-season testing, but it also soon suffered a significant early setback. The MCL40 had its first ever lap on a racetrack a couple of hours into day 3 of this week's test, which makes McLaren one of the few teams using this test as a literal shakedown. McLaren had already committed to a late start on track to take advantage of the test taking place over 5 days and teams being permitted to run on 3 of them. McLaren wanted to give itself as much time as possible for development, so opted not to shake down its car on a filming day before Barcelona or hurry to be on track at the start of the test. It had mooted running on Tuesday but opted against that, instead taking more time to get its car and final preparations ready, a decision aided by day 2 being disrupted by rain. But by starting on Wednesday and joining the session a couple of hours in, McLaren has given itself less flexibility than the others for the rest of the week. It had to then get back out on track early on Thursday, which it did, and run again on Friday, so there's no downtime in between to fix any issues, and that meant a good first day was essential. Once the early installation laps and checks were complete, McLaren was quickly down to work, and Lando Norris said it turned out to be a decent day. Norris completed 76 laps, which was solid in the circumstances, even if the Works Mercedes team smashed in a whopping 183 laps on its second full day of running. McLaren was quite happy with how well the car ran out of the blocks on day 1, with chief designer Rob Marshall saying there were no nasties, no really scary things that went wrong. But this was replaced by a bigger issue on McLaren's second day. Oscar Piastri's running was ended early on Thursday as McLaren suffered a fuel system issue, which required the car to be fully stripped down for McLaren to identify the source. It left Piastri on just 48 laps, which is only 1/3 of what Mercedes has managed every day this week. It's not as dramatic a blow as, say, Red Bull's day-ending shunt late on Tuesday, but as Performance Technical Director Mark Temple noted, every minute of track time is precious at such an early stage of the season. And even though it's still so early in testing, McLaren's felt the need to point out that some competitors are already setting a very high bar for performance, so it knows this has put it behind the curve set by Mercedes, which we'll come onto more later in this video. So that's how McLaren's test suffered an early setback. But what about the car itself? Unsurprisingly, the real MCL40 has given us a lot to look at compared to the renders McLaren revealed at the start of the week before it hit the track. This car is meant to have benefited from that additional development time we talked about, and McLaren intends for the version it races in Australia to be closer to this launch spec than what some other teams are doing, and that certainly shows in parts of the car. The nose, for example, is a slimmer design at the tip than what we've seen from the others, and though it's mounted to the main plane like most cars except the Mercedes, the shape and height at the tip allows for a lot of airflow under the central part of the car to the floor. To get the nose that way, which must be saving a bit of weight as well as having an aero impact, will not have been the work of a moment. Although it's fairly difficult to see the profile under the nose, it looks like it's V-shaped with the breakpoint on the side and what looks like the lower floor section. This opens up the area under the nose, giving the central section of the front wing more clearance, allowing better quality airflow to the central part of the underfloor. And there's more interesting detail with what our resident ex-technical director Gary Anderson has christened snowplow vanes, which all have a slightly different profile, plus what looks like the actuator arm for the front wing active aerodynamics. An obvious change versus the renders is the McLaren sports a large horizontal fin on the upper outer surface of the front wing end plates. Some other teams have a similar appendage, some have foregone it entirely, and where the FIA stands on such an aggressive dive plane treatment will be interesting, as it clearly has an influence on outwash, which the rule makers want to avoid as it makes following harder for the cars behind. This fin will help direct the airflow down into what is called the tyre squirt area, where the rotating tyre forces the airflow around its contact patch with the track surface. If that's allowed to go around the inside, it disrupts the airflow to the rest of the car. If pushed around the tyre, that flow will then join up with the airflow coming through the tunnel in the lower footplate of the end plate and help seal the underside of the wing. This will improve its performance, and that airflow will then be pulled around into the void behind the front tyre and into the barge board area. As expected, the barge boards on the McLaren launch renders were a primitive design. The small vertical slot to manage the turbulent weight behind the front tyre still seems to be there, as is the lower curved surface to extract some flow from the footplate, but the real thing is distinct compared to other top teams. Some have opted for much bigger horizontal slats, whereas McLaren has 2 smaller slots below the main surface. Then it looks like the front of the floor curves upwards too, to sort of replicate the effect of another vane. This will help extract airflow out from the bargeboard footplate. Looking at some head-on images of the car that emerged, the inlet of the front brake duct shows a lot more detail. It's divided up into areas to vary the cooling across the internal parts that need it. The inner surface creates a wall to contain the airflow spilling off the front tyre, and managing this flow reduces the negative effect it would have on the downforce producing devices coming along behind. It's similar at the rear end, with the brake duct inner surface there to contain the airflow spillage coming off the rear tyre. Analysing this area of the car also shows some small louvers on the floor just in front of the rear tyre, which feed into the rear tyre outward tyre squirt to manage the airflow around the tyre contact patch. But there's no obvious sign from this angle of the mouse hole in the diffuser that we've seen on cars like the Mercedes and the Red Bull. Picking up on a mechanical choice, McLaren has changed front suspension concept from last year, switching from pull rod to push rod for this season, which keeps it in line with what the vast majority have chosen and has been driven by what best suited the airflow off the front wing. The height difference in the inboard pickup points is what gives you the degree of anti-dive, which is great to support the car when you have braking torque going through the suspension system, so it helps control the car and provide a more stable aero platform. But it has an impact on how the front end responds and the feeling it gives the drivers, and with this height difference the anti-dive is a lot, probably even more than last year when Norris spent the first third of the season struggling to consistently extract the most from the car. McLaren toppled its engine supplier as the best Mercedes powered team a couple of years ago and didn't really have any moments where it looked like that would change over the rest of that rule set. But the 2026 overhaul has given Mercedes a golden opportunity to re-establish itself as top dog. And remember, you can be the first to know the inside track on F1's biggest shakeup in decades by joining the Race Members Club. It's the perfect time to make us your F1 Paddock Pass for 2026 by claiming a 7-day free trial of the Members Club via the link below. You'll get the true picture of what's happening in F1 and if Mercedes' early showing translates into real performance, as it's going about its business very impressively, racking up long runs for fun at this test, and even completed a race simulation on its second day of running. Drivers George Russell and Kimi Antonelli have basically traded setting the fastest lap of the test, but Russell's right to say this means next to nothing as the cars are only going to get faster, so we're not reading into it from a performance perspective. It's more in terms of what the teams want to get from the test, reliability and understanding, and the W17 is proving to be a tough early benchmark to match for any car, not just the MCL40. McLaren doesn't intend to get a huge amount of setup optimization done at this test, partly as it's so cold at Barcelona that doing anything representative will be difficult. At Mercedes, Russell even said the track temperatures are some of the coldest he's ever encountered. So for McLaren, which is a little behind in understanding its new car in the real world, Marshall said the last couple of days are more about exploring the windows in which the car will run. The MCL40 has debuted with quite a lot of rake, where the rear ride height is in relative terms much greater than the front. This basically disappeared in the ground effect era because those floors demanded the car to be run as low to the ground as possible. Now with flatter floors, the 2026 cars have to be run differently, but where that sweet spot is and how the car actually behaves when you run it at different ride heights is a complete unknown, so that all has to be figured out again. McLaren will also be working out how the car withstands different on-track conditions. That'll mean pushing for longer and longer runs, and given how reliably the Mercedes engine is running already in other cars, it wouldn't be a surprise to see McLaren try a race simulation before the test is over. The pecking order won't become remotely clear until deep into the 6 days of Bahrain testing, and by then, McLaren may well be getting its MCL40 nicely dialed in and maybe looking even more impressive than the W17. But there is no question that Mercedes is F1's best prepared team at the moment, and that is McLaren's first priority to address.